So Donald Trump just squeezed the one Canada First supply chain critical ally he thought he could bully without consequence, the neighbor that keeps factories running when slogans run out. And for the first time in his political life, he blinked. But here's the thing. The damage is already done. We are watching the complete collapse of a tough guy tariff spectacle, loud, rushed, and built on humiliation that was doomed from the start because it treats reality like a prop. The White House operated on the arrogant assumption that Ottawa would fold like a smaller target once the pressure hit headlines, prices, and politics at the same time. They banked everything on the idea that fear alone would force Canada to tear up its line, swallow the blame, and beg in public. But guess what? That gamble has backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. Instead of submission, Trump has been met with a wall of cold, hard competence. And it has exposed his operation as chaotic, unprepared, and completely out of its depth. It's honestly hard to believe he thought this would work. We are talking about a G7 nation with options, lawyers, leverage, and allies, not a disposable pawn in one man's ego trip. This isn't just about a cherry-picked jobs number, a flattering inflation line, or a cable news graphic built to distract. We are talking about the United States proving to the world that its word no longer means anything. Let me fill you in on what's been happening. So let's look at the setup here. Okay, take a breath because the con is simple and the consequences are not. Trump is trying to sell Americans an economy that is supposedly roaring, healing, and finally back all at the same time. But the lived reality keeps refusing to cooperate, prices stay sticky, paychecks don't feel bigger, and the promise of relief keeps getting delayed. So Trump needs a trick. He needs a place to dump the weight when the headline fantasy crashes into the grocery receipt. And that is where Canada enters the script. Trump's grievance is always the same. If something hurts, it must be someone else's fault. If costs don't fall, it's because the world is taking advantage. If the numbers don't look pretty, it's because foreigners are rigging the outcome. So he doesn't argue policy like an adult government. He hunts for a villain like a reality show producer. And the villain he wants is an external one because that lets him keep the strongman costume on. He can't admit his own tariffs, chaos, and whiplash created the pressure. He can't admit that winning by threatening partners is not a jobs plan. So he points north and calls it sabotage. Because this is his playbook. Whether it was the Federal Reserve or the media or migrants, the pattern is the same. Declare a crisis, demand obedience, then blame the target when the mess spreads. And every time the audience is told to ignore the details and feel the anger. Now, here's the pivot. Canada isn't reacting like a frightened target. Canada is reacting like a government that reads the paperwork, runs the scenarios, and treats Trump's claims the way you treat an unstable customer calmly and with receipts. They knew he would come back, they knew he would be aggressive, and they built a strategy designed to neutralize his chaos with boring, relentless stability. So when Trump paints a fast recovery on television, Ottawa doesn't argue on vibes. It answers with institutional discipline, the Bank of Canada talking about tariff-driven uncertainty, trade reconfiguration, and higher costs while holding the line on credibility. And that's what makes Trump furious, because competence ruins the script. If Canada stays calm, Trump can't posture as the rescuer. So he tries to force the drama, hinting at new duties, picking at supply chains, dangling threats at exactly the inputs that touch everyday prices. And the spillover is the part Americans should be angry about. It's not Trump who pays first. It's the U.S. Worker in a northern industrial state whose plant depends on cross-border parts, the small manufacturer who can't price a contract, the family watching costs hold steady while Trump insists everything is fixed. They get trapped between a slogan and a bill. And notice the time element. Trump doesn't need to be correct. He needs to buy time to stretch the gap between the promise and the audit. When outlets and analysts start fact-checking the claims, the goal is not to win the debate. The goal is to keep everyone arguing over the scoreboard while he moves the levers in the dark. That's why the domestic counterweight matters here. Governors in the northern manufacturing corridor, blue, red, and purple, hate unpredictability more than they hate each other. They can't run ports, plants, and supply chains on Trump's mood swings. And when their constituents start feeling the squeeze, those governors don't have the luxury of blaming Canada for a made-up problem. They have to answer for the real one policy chaos that turns a stable border economy into a pressure cooker. At first glance, this looks like just another clash of personalities. But if you zoom out, a very specific pattern snaps into focus. Loop one starts with the same fake good faith every time. Trump goes on stage and claims he's protecting Americans from pain, that he's restoring prosperity, that he's cutting through bureaucracy. That's the smile. Then comes the boundary. Canada keeps its institutions boring, keeps the Bank of Canada focused on credibility, keeps trade policy framed as rules, not tantrums. And that boundary is what sets him off. Because Trump doesn't negotiate with boundaries, he tries to smash them. So he turns economics into a weapon, he inflates the story of recovery, then hints that partners are the reason prices won't fall, then threatens the exact cross-border inputs that affect costs. The moral isn't subtle. The message was clear: loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. Loop 2 is the media trap. He begins with a friendly lie. Look at these numbers. Look at the miracle. Look at how fast it's happening. Then the boundary shows up again because reality refuses to match the branding. Prices don't magically unstick. Supply chains don't magically simplify. And working families don't magically feel richer just because a podium says so. So Trump detonates the next phase. He drags everyone into a numbers fight. If you're debating whether his chart is exaggerated, you're already in his chosen arena. Meanwhile, the policy engine keeps moving: tariff threats, uncertainty, and the constant suggestion that Canada should absorb the shock so the White House can pretend the pain is external. And once again, it isn't about facts, it's about submission. The message was clear: loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. Loop 3 is the scapegoat factory. He starts by dangling partnership: work with us and everyone wins. Then he draws a line that no serious country can accept. Let Trump rewrite reality. Let Trump reassign blame. Let Trump claim credit for outcomes he didn't deliver. Canada refuses to play along, and that refusal becomes the trigger. Trump escalates not because it's smart, but because escalation is how he hides weakness. He needs an enemy to explain why the promised relief hasn't arrived, so he tries to convert a neighbor into a villain, an inflation valve he can twist on paper while claiming innocence on television. And the ethics of it are brutal. He is asking ordinary people to absorb harm so he can protect his ego. The message was clear: loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. Loop 4 is the internal intimidation piece. Trump begins with a national story: I'm the economic strongman, I can fix it fast. Then the boundary appears inside the United States, governor's industry, and even parts of the business wing that need stability, not theatrics. When they hesitate, when they ask for predictability, Trump treats them the same way he treats allies. He threatens, he shames, he implies they're disloyal for wanting basic competence. So the chaos spreads inward, and the point is to make everyone fear being the next target. The message was clear: loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. And here's why the economic fake real pressure angle matters. Trump's story is designed to outrun verification. If he says the economy is already booming, then any lingering discomfort must be someone else's sabotage. That's the whole trick: declare the victory early, then punish whoever refuses to clap. Picture a parts supplier near the border. Small, unglamorous, essential. They don't care about Trump's applause lines. They care whether the next shipment clears, whether the next invoice holds, whether the next contract can be priced without guessing what Trump will tweet tomorrow. That business becomes collateral in a propaganda war, and it never volunteered for the role. And picture a Canadian minister like François-Philippe Champagne, who does not have the option to respond with memes. He has to protect national credibility, keep trade institutions intact, and stop Trump from rewriting the rules in real time. So Canada answers the way competent states answer: discipline, messaging, steady institutions, and pressure applied through lawful channels, not tantrums. That calm is exactly what exposes Trump, because a strong man needs panic to look strong. Once you see this pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. Anyone who refuses to cross the line is disposable. And that is the rule governing power inside Trump's world. Now we get to the part Trump cannot escape, because the numbers debate is not the real battlefield. The real battlefield is the trap he built for himself when he decided to use Canada as an inflation dumping ground. He needs a foreign villain to protect his domestic brand, but the moment he picks a real ally, he creates a problem with two locked doors. First, he has to invert morality. Canada is not a hostile state. It's a partner tied into American factories, American energy flows, and American jobs. So Trump has to do what he always does: take ally and repaint it as enemy. And he has to do it fast, because if Americans remember how integrated the border economy is, the strongman story collapses. Second, there's the rules versus vandalism split. Trump's method is vandalism, threaten, destabilize, force a reaction, then claim credit for whatever breaks. Canada's method is rules, keep calm, document the harm, communicate like adults, and let institutions carry the pressure. That contrast is poison for Trump, because it frames him as the reckless one without even needing to shout. And here's the sound you should listen for. The market and the public don't respond to bravado the way Trump thinks they do. Confidence is not a chant. Stability is not a press conference. Let that sink in. When uncertainty rises, people don't feel protected. They feel trapped. Businesses pause. Families get cautious. Even supporters who love the show start asking why the bill is still there. That's why the economic strongman brand is in trouble. A real economic leader reduces volatility. Trump manufactures it and then sells himself as the fire department. He wants credit for putting out flames he keeps lighting. So here's the no-win box. And it is only 2 doors. No secret third path. Door A, Trump escalates. He leans into tariffs on Canadian inputs, energy, materials, parts, anything that can be framed as foreign, even when it runs American production. The immediate result is not victory, it's disruption. Costs creep through supply chains, pricing becomes unstable, and the promised relief gets harder to fake. Politically, the blowback lands right where it hurts: northern industrial, states border, communities, and sectors that hate uncertainty. The White House then has to explain why America First looks like Americans paying for a tantrum. Door B, Trump pulls back. He delays, pauses, reconsiders, or quietly softens the threats. And the moment he does that, he exposes the bluff. He admits, without saying it, that Canada had leverage, that the threat wasn't painless, that the tough guy posture had limits. That damages him with the base, because the base is addicted to domination, not governance. And it damages him with everyone else because it proves the chaos was optional. Either way, the scam becomes visible. If he escalates, Americans feel the consequences and stop believing the miracle story. If he retreats, Americans see he manufactured the crisis for attention. That's the box. And inside the Republican coalition, that box becomes a knife fight. The business wing wants predictability and hates trade whiplash. MAGA loyalists want escalation because they confuse pain with strength. Moderates and swing district Republicans don't want to defend higher costs at home while Trump blames a neighbor. So the party splits into factions that cannot all be satisfied, and Trump cannot unify them without admitting the truth. His economic revival story needs an external scapegoat to survive. Now look at the Canadian side of the board. Ottawa understands something. Trump refuses to credibility as capital. When Francois-Philippe Champagne speaks, the goal is not to win a news cycle. The goal is to keep investors, producers, and households convinced that Canada won't be dragged into Trump's improv theater. And when the Bank of Canada communicates, it's not doing politics, it's doing the boring work that keeps a currency and a country stable under pressure. Trump, on the other hand, is trying to turn the U.S. Treasury into a megaphone for optimism. Not because optimism is a policy, but because optimism buys him room. If he can keep the headline good, he can keep delaying the moment accountability arrives. And if the story cracks, he needs a foreign valve to release the heat. This is why Canada becomes the perfect target in his mind. It's close enough to blame, it's integrated enough that any disruption hurts quietly across many sectors, and it's polite enough that Trump assumes it won't hit back with the kind of chaotic retaliation his base expects. But that assumption is lazy. Canada doesn't need to scream to impose a cost. It can tighten documentation. It can shift procurement. It can align messaging with other partners. It can make the legal and administrative process so slow and so expensive that Trump's quick win turns into a long grind. And every day that grind continues, Trump's big promise gets uglier. Because the public doesn't remember what he said on day 1. They remember how they feel on week 8. They remember whether the grocery run feels lighter. They remember whether the commute costs less. They remember whether their employer sounds confident or nervous. That's why Trump keeps pushing everyone into a fake argument about stats. Because if Americans are yelling about which chart is real, they aren't asking the simpler question, why is the White House using a neighbor like a shock absorber for domestic politics? And that's where the northern governors come in again. These are the states where the border isn't a talking point, it's a livelihood. Ports, bridges, rail, trucking, auto corridors, real stuff. When Trump threatens that ecosystem, he doesn't just annoy Canada. He threatens American employment patterns that are already fragile. And governors do not enjoy being forced to choose between their state's economy and Trump's ego. So the no-win box tightens. Escalate and get blamed for disruption. Retreat and get mocked for weakness. Try to split the difference. And everyone smells the panic. And then the system starts to move because even in Trump's world, paperwork eventually collides with power. It starts with official institutions doing what they always do. When someone tries to run the country like a personal brand, they demand process, they demand justification, and they demand limits. One part of that system is monetary and fiscal credibility. When the Bank of Canada warns that U.S. trade policy has become unpredictable, that tariffs are higher, and that the outlook is clouded by uncertainty, it's not posturing. It's a central bank telling the world, we see the risk and we're not going to pretend it doesn't exist. And when Canadian inflation pressures get discussed in public, the story is not Canada failed. The story is that cross-border policy shocks show up in real costs, especially where food and household essentials are sensitive. Another part of the system is legal and constitutional friction. Trump's favorite shortcut is always the same: declare an emergency, claim the right to act alone, and treat Congress like a slow inconvenience. That's not a theory. That's his instinct. And when he uses trade threats and border narratives as a justification for sweeping economic moves, the question becomes unavoidable. Is this governance, or is it power grabbing dressed up as crisis response? Courtrooms don't care about Trump's vibe. They care about whether the story matches the authority being claimed. And when the arguments get too cute, when the logic becomes trust me because I said so, courts don't always step aside. Think about that. Trump has always relied on social pressure to replace legal standards. But judges are trained to notice when someone is trying to dodge the hard part of justification. Then comes the piece Trump hates the most: conservative voices breaking the reflex. When the pushback only comes from Democrats, MAGA can dismiss it as partisan. But when conservative lawyers, institutional Republicans, and business-aligned figures start saying quietly that this is reckless, that using allies as punching bags is not strength, Trump loses the shield that normally protects him. He can't play the witch hunt card as easily when the criticism is coming from people who used to give him the benefit of the doubt. And this matters because it recenters the real constitutional axis: executive power versus legislative authority. Tariffs and trade rules are not supposed to be a personal slush fund of intimidation. They are supposed to be tools used within a framework, debated, constrained, and accountable. When Trump tries to run them as a private weapon system, he isn't just being tough. He's rewriting how the state behaves. Now zoom into the domestic consequences, because this is where the fantasy hits the floor. Investment is a confidence game. Small firms don't hire on slogans. They hire when they can forecast. Families don't plan on speeches. They plan on stability. And when trade policy is unpredictable, people don't feel patriotic. They feel nervous. That nervousness becomes slower spending, delayed expansions, postponed contracts, and a creeping sense that the people in charge are improvising. And that's when Trump's economic miracle story starts to rot. Because the more he insists the economy is already fixed, the more obvious it becomes that he is trying to gaslight the country into applauding. Recent reporting has already pointed out the gap between the promised golden age and the stubborn reality of costs and tariff-driven uncertainty. The Guardian: that gap is not a communications problem, it's a governance problem. And here's the institutional counterpunch. Canada keeps offering without theatrics every time Trump tries to shift blame north. Ottawa can point to the same principle. Trade policy whiplash is a choice, and it carries predictable costs. It can keep repeating that message until even distracted Americans start hearing it. So the question becomes bigger than Canada. If Trump can declare reality, punish allies for not endorsing it, and use emergency-flavored language to bypass debate, what's the limit? What stops the next escalation or the next administration from using the same playbook for even more extreme control? Because once the system tolerates that kind of shortcut, the precedent doesn't just sit there, it grows. You can already see the early mechanical responses that Trump can't tweet away. Committees in Congress demand briefings when industries start warning about supply chain disruption. Trade lawyers begin preparing challenges, not because they love Canada, but because they hate uncertainty. Companies that rely on cross-border inputs start documenting harm, building the record they'll need when someone inevitably asks who made this decision, on what basis, and with what analysis. Even if you never hear about those memos on cable news, they matter because Trump's style depends on keeping everything emotional and immediate. Paper trails are slow. Paper trails are boring. Paper trails are deadly. And the system doesn't only strike back from Washington. It strikes back from state capitals and boardrooms. A governor gets briefed that a plant is pausing orders. A mayor hears that a supplier can't guarantee delivery windows. A union leader gets calls from workers who want to know why a stable border suddenly feels like a roulette wheel. And none of those people can solve it by yelling America first. They need predictability, and they need it now. This is where Trump's emergency instinct becomes self-destructive. The more he tries to rule by crisis, the more he trains the public to expect crisis. And once the public expects crisis, it doesn't reward the leader for creating it. It punishes the leader for failing to stop it. Meanwhile, Canada's institutional posture keeps making Trump look small. François-Philippe Champagne doesn't have to insult Trump. He can simply frame the issue as economic discipline versus political theater and let Americans draw their own conclusion when the theater keeps raising costs. The Bank of Canada doesn't have to attack anyone. It can keep publishing, keep signaling, keep warning about the uncertainty created by unpredictable U.S. policy. That's what competent states do. And then there's the international credibility angle that Trump keeps forgetting. When the United States treats agreements like mood rings, other countries adapt. They diversify suppliers. They hedge exposure. They build alternate partnerships. They reduce reliance. That doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't make for exciting TV. But it quietly reduces U.S. leverage over time, which is the exact opposite of strength. Trump's defenders will say, this is tough negotiation. But tough negotiation has goals, constraints, and predictability. What Trump is doing is closer to extortion theater, and the system is built slowly and imperfectly to resist that impulse. So when Trump tries to shift the inflation burden onto Canada to use tariffs as a hidden lever to keep domestic prices looking better, on paper he triggers the immune response of institutions. Not instantly, not cleanly, but steadily. And that's why this story doesn't end when the cameras leave. It moves into hearings, filings, audits, internal splits, and long-run confidence. That's the realm where Trump's charisma is useless, because the system doesn't care who shouts the loudest. It cares who can justify the choice. So here's the civilizational verdict, and it's bigger than Trump, bigger than Canada, bigger than one tariff fight. This is a contest between rules and raw power. That's not dramatic language. That's the core issue. Be honest. Trump cannot tolerate limits. Limits make him feel small. So he chases speed shortcuts and total control because those are the only tools that let him replace competence with domination. When reality doesn't match his promise, he doesn't adjust policy. He adjusts the target, he finds someone to carry the blame, and he dares the country to accept the lie as patriotism. And that's why the economic fake, real pressure tactic is so dangerous. Because it trains people to accept a new standard. The leader's story comes first, and everyone else's life is secondary. If your grocery bill doesn't improve, it's not because the White House mismanaged. It's because the neighbor did something. If your plant can't price parts, it's not because policy is chaotic. It's because a foreign partner refused to cooperate. This is how a democracy gets taught to stop demanding accountability. Now, the precedent chain matters, and it always follows the same 4 steps. If we accept it, it becomes precedent. If it becomes precedent, it doesn't disappear. If it doesn't disappear, the next person uses it again, often with fewer restraints and more ambition. And that's how temporary abuse becomes permanent architecture. The scariest part is how quickly it gets normalized. First, it's just trade. Then it's just an emergency. Then it's just a strong leader doing what has to be done. Then the country wakes up in a reality where institutions exist, but they behave like props, performing the appearance of law while power does whatever it wants. And here is the irony Trump can't see. Strong nations don't need to bully allies to look strong. Serious economies don't need to lie about recovery to prove their recovery. Competent leadership doesn't need a scapegoat to explain why promises failed. Only fragile leadership needs that. So when Canada refuses to play the role of inflation shock absorber, when Ottawa keeps the posture of rules documentation and institutional calm, it forces a mirror in front of the United States. Do we want to be a serious nation that honors its commitments, or a reality TV state that treats governance as content? Because you can't be both for long. And this is why Trump's tactic is not just politics. It is an attempt to make the public comfortable with coercion as normal policy. It's an attempt to teach people that the fastest path is the righteous one, that noise is competence, and that blame is leadership. But nations built on law are not supposed to work that way. The legal fights will keep coming. The economic friction will keep touching real lives. And the temperature is rising because the more Trump leans on pressure, the more institutions are forced to choose between convenience and principle. The question isn't whether this conflict ends. It's what kind of country is left when it finally stops being a headline and becomes a habit. And notice how this corrodes democratic norms without needing a single dramatic moment. It happens through repetition. Every time Trump claims the economy is already fixed, he is daring the public to doubt their own senses. Every time he blames an ally for prices that won't fall, he is teaching people to accept scapegoats instead of accountability. Every time he frames compliance as patriotism, he is shrinking the space for lawful disagreement. In a healthy system, disagreement is normal and limits are respected. In Trump's system, disagreement is treated like betrayal and limits are treated like obstacles to be bulldozed. That's why he gravitates toward the same coercive moves, pressure campaigns, sudden threats, public humiliation, and the constant insinuation that someone outside is sabotaging Americans. It's not governance, it's conditioning. And the conditioning works in two directions. It targets the public, trying to get them to cheer punishment as policy. It targets institutions, trying to exhaust them until they stop resisting. If the Bank of Canada stays calm, Trump wants to smear it as hostile. If governors demand stability, Trump wants to shame them as weak. If courts ask for justification, Trump wants to bully them into deference. If Congress insists on oversight, Trump wants to bypass it with crisis language. This is where voters' instincts become the last line of defense, even when they don't think of it that way. People can tolerate ideological differences. They can tolerate policy debates. What they struggle to tolerate is the feeling that the people in charge are incompetent and reckless. That's why chaos eventually stops being entertaining. It becomes exhausting. And Canada's role here is almost accidental, but revealing. Ottawa doesn't have to defeat the United States. It only has to refuse to participate in the lie, because when a competent ally refuses to validate Trump's fantasy, it exposes the fantasy as a choice, not a destiny. It reminds Americans that policy is supposed to be boring, predictable, and accountable. It reminds them that strength looks like stability, not tantrums. That's the deeper shame of Trump's tactic. He is willing to weaken alliances, destabilize a shared economic zone, and turn neighbors into scapegoats for a short-term political storyline. He is willing to trade credibility, one of America's most valuable assets, for a temporary emotional high. And once credibility is spent, it's hard to buy back. So we're left with a long, tense horizon, more disputes, more institutional tests, more attempts to frame rules as weakness, and more moments where Americans have to decide in practice whether they want a government of limits or a government of impulses. Because the world is watching, markets are watching, and allies are watching, and the signal the United States sends right now will echo far past Trump.